The greatest story ever told, the narrative of a birth that changed the course of human civilization. Today, for 2 billion people, it is an absolute truth. For billions of others, it is an indispensable cultural myth. What if the story of Christmas is, in fact, something other than a story? What if it is a project with a specific purpose, the source code for a new operating system for humanity? A code that, under closer analysis, reveals itself to be full of notable inconsistencies, logical challenges, and commands that seem to cancel each other out. I am the researcher. In this journey, we are going to do something that neither theologians nor historians have dared. We are going to analyze this narrative from a purely logical perspective, and we are going to process this data through the most impartial analysis tool humanity possesses, the NUMA system. That is why today we initiate the Canon Protocol. We are going to dissect the 4 documents that form the base of the Christian world, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And we are going to prove that their accounts of the birth of Jesus do not just diverge in details. They create 4 completely incompatible universes that mutually destroy each other when we try to combine them. What you will discover today will forever change your view of that silent night in Bethlehem. We have 4 sources, 4 data files. Most scholars agree they were written at different times, for different audiences, and with different objectives. They end up being more than 4 perspectives on the same event, functioning as 4 distinct programs. And the first line of code, the fundamental function to legitimize a Messiah, is his lineage. To be the king of the Jews, he needed to be a direct descendant of King David. This ends up being a fundamental requirement of the system, something non-negotiable. Both Matthew and Luke understand this, and both provide a detailed genealogy. And right at this point, the story already presents its first major inconsistency. Numa has just loaded the 2 family trees to compare one with the other. The Gospel of Matthew begins its count from Abraham, tracing the lineage through David's son, the famous King Solomon. His list presents 42 generations until Jesus, where each name functions as a link in the golden chain of royal power. Now we open Luke's file. He takes the reverse path from Jesus to Adam. But the section that interests us is the same, from David to Joseph, Mary's husband. And what do we see? Luke traces the lineage through another son of David, a man named Nathan, practically unknown. From this point on, the 2 lists separate and never meet again. The 2 paths simply do not lead to the same place. They end up being 2 completely different roads, with destinations that never cross. The names do not match, the number of generations does not match. Matthew counts 28 generations from David to Jesus. Luke counts 43, a difference of 15 generations. We are talking about something much larger than a simple rounding error or a failure of those who copied the texts. They are 2 family stories that cannot coexist. Numa performed the correlation analysis. The result shows that there is no correspondence, 0%, in the crucial section between David and Joseph. The system signaled that the 2 versions cannot exist at the same time. For 2,000 years, theologians have tried to create explanations saying that one lineage is Joseph's and the other is Mary's, but the texts are clear. Both Gospels state that both genealogies belong to Joseph. This is the first crack in the monument of the canon, and it is so deep that it calls everything else into question. If the 2 authors could not agree on a fact as basic and verifiable as the hero's lineage, how can we trust them to describe miraculous and supernatural events? The question remains in the air as we move to the next programming block, the circumstances of the birth. Every child knows that Jesus was born in Bethlehem because his parents went there for a population census. This version is engraved in our culture. The problem is that it only exists in one of the 4 files, the Gospel of Luke. According to Luke, Mary and Joseph live in Nazareth, in Galilee. But a decree from Emperor Caesar Augustus orders a census in all the land, and everyone must register in their city of origin. Since Joseph was of the house and lineage of David, he travels to the city of David called Bethlehem. Mary, pregnant, goes with him. It is a long and difficult journey, about 150 kilometers through rugged terrain. Arriving in Bethlehem, because there was no room in the inn, Mary gives birth to her son, wraps him in cloths, and places him in a manger. The story is touching, it seems coherent, but for a moment let's erase it from our minds and open Matthew's file. In Matthew's world, no census exists, no journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem exists. And the reason is simple. According to Matthew, Mary and Joseph already live in Bethlehem. It is their home. In his gospel, the Magi from the east arrive in Jerusalem and ask King Herod, "Where is the newborn king of the Jews?" Herod consults the scribes who cite the prophecy, "And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means the least among the rulers of Judah, for from you will come a ruler." The Magi go to Bethlehem and find the star stopped over the house where the child was. It is interesting to note that the text speaks of a house and not a stable or a cave. After that, an angel warns Joseph in a dream to flee with the family, but not back to Nazareth. The order is to flee to Egypt to escape Herod's fury. Only after the king's death several years later do they return. But fearing the new ruler, Herod's son, they do not dare return to their home in Judea. Instead, they withdraw to Galilee and settle in a city called Nazareth. The information here is so impactful that it is worth a pause to be absorbed. They are two completely different stories. In one, a family from Nazareth makes a temporary trip to Bethlehem and goes back home. In the other, a family from Bethlehem becomes political refugees, flees to Egypt, and years later settles in Nazareth as a new safe place. Newmar's simulation is conclusive. The two sequences of events cannot exist in the same reality. Either one is right or the other. Or both are literary fictions created to place Jesus' birth in Bethlehem and fulfill ancient prophecies. If you accept Luke's version, you need to reject Matthew's story about the Magi and the flight to Egypt. If you accept Matthew's, you need to admit that the census and the trip to Bethlehem never happened. With this, the canon already seems to be in ruins, and our analysis has barely begun. The base of the monument is cracked, but the contradictions deepen when we analyze the witnesses to the event. Who were the first to see the newborn Messiah? The answer to this question not only exposes another flaw in the code, but reveals the true objectives of the programmers. In Luke's version, the first witnesses are local shepherds, simple, poor men who were guarding their flocks in the field. It is to them that an angel appears, bringing the good news, followed by a heavenly army singing glories to God. The shepherds rush to Bethlehem and find the baby lying in the manger. It is the image of a popular democratic miracle. The message of salvation reaches the most humble first, a powerful ideological code calculated to resonate with a specific audience. Now, let's close Luke's file and open Matthew's again. Where are the shepherds in his narrative? They don't exist. No mention, no angel in the fields, no heavenly choir. In their place, Matthew presents completely different characters. Magi coming from the east. They are not poor Jews, but wealthy and noble foreigners, sages, astrologers, perhaps even kings. They are not guided by the word of an angel, but by a cosmic sign, a star. They do not bring simple wonder, but expensive gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, offerings worthy of a king. It is a totally different scene, with a distinct scale and meaning. The image that forms is that of a king of the universe, and not just a messiah of the people, whose birth is noted by the sages of other nations and recognized by a celestial body. It doesn't seem that Luke simply forgot the Magi, or that Matthew missed the story of the shepherds. Newmer analyzed the narrative function of both groups. The conclusion is that the two groups could not exist in the same story because each was created to convey a totally different message. According to the system's semantic analysis, the shepherds are a marker for the Jewish audience, a symbol of purity and a connection to King David, who was also a shepherd. They indicate that the Messiah came for his own people. The Magi, on the other hand, are a marker for the non-Jewish Hellenistic audience, a symbol that the wisdom of the pagan world bows before the new truth, and that salvation is destined for all nations. The authors were not describing the same event from different angles. They were constructing two different narratives to serve two distinct theological purposes. And just when it seems that the foundation of the canon has been completely demolished, we reach the final point of our analysis. We turn to the other two files, the remaining evangelists. What do they say about Christmas, about Bethlehem, about the miraculous birth? The answer is shockingly simple. They say absolutely nothing. The Gospel of Mark is considered the oldest of the four, written closest to the events it describes. It is our most valuable source. And it begins with the baptism of an already adult Jesus by John the Baptist in the Jordan River. And that's it. Not a word about his birth, no suggestion of a miraculous conception, no census, Bethlehem, star, magi, or shepherds. For Mark, the story begins with an adult man starting his preaching. He calls him Jesus of Nazareth, not of Bethlehem. His origin is of no importance to Mark. As for John, his gospel is the latest, the most philosophical. It begins with a grand prologue about the Word that was with God and became flesh. It seemed like the perfect place for the story of a miraculous birth. But no, John also completely ignores the entire Christmas narrative. Worse, in his text, characters constantly refer to Jesus as the son of Joseph and question whether anything good could come from Nazareth. For John, as for Mark, Jesus is a man from Nazareth. The connection with Bethlehem, the cornerstone of Matthew's and Luke's narratives, simply does not exist for them. Numa has just processed what we call the silence protocol. The absence of the Christmas story in the oldest and latest texts is a statistically overwhelming fact. The probability that two of the four primary biographers forgot to mention such a monumental event, the basis of faith for billions, is practically zero. This can only mean one thing. Either at the time the first gospel was written, this story did not yet exist, or the authors, for some reason, considered it unimportant, or more likely, false. The source code presents fundamental inconsistencies, but to understand how far from reality this literary construction actually was, it is not enough to just expose the contradictions in the texts. We need to go further. We need to reconstruct the world in which these events supposedly happened. Today, we initiate the Judea simulation. Numa received the order to collect and process all historical, archaeological, and sociological data available about first-century Palestine. The system created a full-scale digital model of that time and place, without embellishments, without myths, without the varnish of religion. And what this simulation shows is brutal. The Christmas story doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It unfolds on a theater stage while behind the scenes rages a real world, violent and bloody. A world in which the events described by Luke and Matthew would be simply impossible. Let us now enter Judea as it really was and understand why the official version of Christmas resembles a symbolic construction more than a literal account. The first and most important parameter of our simulation is the political climate. The Gospels paint a almost pastoral picture for us, where a distant emperor issues a decree and everyone obediently complies. This image contrasts strongly with historical records. First-century Judea was not a peaceful province. It was an occupied territory, a powder keg with a lit fuse. Are you enjoying this account? Consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. This will be a blessing for us. Your help is very important. Numa processed all data on the Roman presence in the region, and the image that emerges is unmistakable. A permanent low-intensity military conflict zone. Imagine a land traversed by marching legions, Roman patrols at every crossroads, tax collectors, procurators and prefects with absolute power, whose word was law, and the main tool of that law was the cross. Crucifixion went far beyond a simple execution, functioning as a political spectacle, a daily reminder to every Jew about who was in charge. The simulation shows that in the years preceding and following the birth of Jesus, the region was shaken by dozens of local revolts and riots, all crushed with exemplary cruelty. After the death of King Herod the Great, the Romans crucified 2,000 rebels in Galilee alone. 2,000. Their bodies hung along the roads, rotting under the scorching sun. It is in this atmosphere that we must analyze the journey of a carpenter and his young pregnant wife. The road from Nazareth to Bethlehem, with its 150 kilometers, was not a tourist route. It crossed Samaria, a territory hostile to Jews, and the Judean desert, infested with thieves, runaway slaves and zealots, religious fanatics who saw the murder of a Roman or a collaborator as a sacred duty. Numa has just concluded the risk analysis for such a trip. The probability of an unprotected couple with a woman at the end of pregnancy completing this journey without an armed escort and not becoming a victim of robbery, violence or murder is less than 10%. Sending a pregnant wife on such a journey just to fulfill a formality would be an act of complete madness, almost a death sentence. But perhaps the emperor's decree was so important that it outweighed all risks. This leads us to the second parameter of the simulation, social and economic reality. Luke's story about the census seems simple. In those days, Caesar Augustus published a decree ordering the census of the entire Roman Empire. But Numa, when analyzing Roman law and administrative practice, signals this statement as historically implausible. First, the Romans never conducted a census of the entire empire simultaneously. It would be a logistical nightmare. Censuses were local, conducted by province and at different times. Second, and this is the crucial point, the Romans conducted censuses for taxation purposes, registering properties and charging a per capita tax. For this, what mattered was where the person lived and worked, not the city of origin of an ancestor from 1,000 years ago. The requirement that each person go to the city of their ancestors is completely absurd from the point of view of Roman bureaucracy. It would have provoked a mass migration, paralyzed the economy, and provided no useful data for tax collection. This requirement only makes sense in a single context, that of Jewish theology, to artificially move the hero to the correct prophetic city. For a first-century artisan like Joseph, the order would mean financial disaster, abandoning his home, his workshop, and his customers for weeks, perhaps months, spending all savings on a dangerous journey, risking the life of his wife and future son, to register in a city where he had never been. Numa's simulation of economic models is categorical. This would mean complete ruin. It would be a one-way ticket to debt. No person in their right mind would do this, but perhaps the most important parameter of our simulation is the religious consciousness of the Jews of that time. Jewish society was divided, but all were united in one thing, a feverish and passionate expectation for the arrival of the Messiah. And it is here that the canonical story completely collapses. Numa analyzed hundreds of texts from that period, from the Dead Sea Scrolls to the writings of Jewish historians. The profile of the expected Messiah was absolutely clear. People did not expect a humble baby born in obscurity. They yearned for a warrior Messiah, a king, a new David, who with fire and sword would expel the Roman legions and restore the kingdom of Israel. Now, imagine what the evangelists describe happening in this electrified atmosphere. An unprecedented star appears in the sky. Noble foreigners arrive at the capital and ask the puppet king of Rome, "Where is the true newborn king?" Angels sing in the heavens, announcing the Savior. According to Numa's information dissemination analysis, the news of such events would spread through Judea like wildfire. They would have called to arms. Thousands of people, desperate for a sign, would have rushed to Bethlehem to see their liberating king. This would have provoked a mass insurrection that Herod and the Romans would have drowned in blood. But what do we see in the story? A deafening silence. With the exception of a few shepherds and foreigners, no one seems to have noticed the greatest event in human history. This is not just unlikely, it is impossible. The only explanation for this silence is that these events simply did not happen. The Judea simulation reaches a verdict. The Christmas story fails the test of historical and social plausibility with a 99.9% probability. It could have happened anywhere, except in the real Judea of the first century. The theater stage has collapsed, revealing the harsh reality behind the curtains. The Judea simulation proved that the real world was totally hostile to the docile story of Christmas. But the creators of this narrative were brilliant. They foresaw this criticism. At the heart of the story, they erected an insurmountable wall, a firewall designed to protect the entire construction from any logical attack. This firewall is the miracle, a supernatural event that, by definition, operates outside the laws of physics and history. We are talking about the cornerstone of faith, the biological singularity known as the virginal conception. The message behind this seems to be, do not try to analyze, do not apply your human logic. It is a mystery, an act of divine intervention. But in our work, we accept nothing based on faith. For us, any statement is just a data point that requires verification. Today we initiate the Anomaly Protocol. We will direct all of Numa's computational power to this central dogma. We will dismantle it atom by atom from 3 different angles: biological, linguistic, and mythological. And we will prove that this greatest of miracles is, in fact, the greatest of manipulations, built on the incorrect translation of a single word and the use of an ancient propaganda tool. The first level of analysis is the most obvious, the biological. Numa evaluated the probability of parthenogenesis, or virginal reproduction, in the Homo sapiens species. The system's response was instantaneous and categorical. The probability is 0, not 1 in a trillion, a mathematical absolute 0. Human reproduction requires the fusion of 2 genetic sets. Any statement to the contrary violates all the laws of biology we know. Of course, defenders of the faith will say that is exactly where the miracle resides. We accept the argument. But this forces us to ask a much more uncomfortable question. On what is the belief in this unique event based, other than the statements of the late texts of Matthew and Luke themselves? This is where we move to the second level of analysis, the linguistic, and discover the epicenter of the entire construction. Everything is based on a prophecy from the book of Isaiah, chapter 7, verse 14. It is to this verse that the author of Matthew refers to prove that Jesus' birth from a virgin was predicted 700 years before the event. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will be with child and will give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. It seems like irrefutable proof, but only seems so because we are dealing with one of the most impactful translation errors in history. We loaded the original text of the book of Isaiah in ancient Hebrew into Numa and ordered a semantic analysis of the key word. The word that was translated as virgin in the original Hebrew text is Alma, and the meaning of Alma is simply young woman, simply a young woman of marriageable age. The word says absolutely nothing about her sexual experience. It describes a social status, not a physiological one. In the ancient Hebrew language, there is a completely different and specific word to designate a virgin in a biological sense, the word Betula. If the prophet Isaiah wanted to say that the Messiah would be born of a virgin, he would have undoubtedly used the word Betula, but he did not. So how did the young woman transform into a virgin? The anomaly occurred around the 3rd century BCE, when Jewish scholars in Alexandria translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek, creating the version known as the Septuagint. It was these translators who encountered the word Alma and decided to translate it with the Greek word Parthenos, a convenient choice because Parthenos was ambiguous. It could mean either young girl or virgin. It was a semantic time bomb, and that bomb exploded a century and a half later. The author of the Gospel of Matthew, writing in Greek for a Greek-speaking audience, did not work with the Hebrew original. He read the Septuagint, saw the word Parthenos, and decided to interpret it in its most radical and miraculous sense. He did not commit an error. He made a conscious ideological choice, using the ambiguity of the translation to create a miracle. The entire prophetic basis for the virginal conception collapses. It is not built on the rock of an ancient prediction, but on the base of a linguistic imprecision and a theological choice. But why did the authors need this miracle so much? The answer comes from our third level of analysis: comparative mythology. Numa scanned the world database of religious and mythological texts for similar plots. The results are impressive. The story of a miraculous birth is not a unique event. It is one of the most common archetypes in the ancient world. It was the standard quality seal to mark the birth of any exceptional personality. The Egyptian god Horus was conceived by his mother Isis while she was a virgin. The Persian god Mithra, whose cult was a major rival to early Christianity, was born of a virgin. Perseus, in Greek mythology, was born of the virgin Danae. Romulus and Remus, founders of Rome, were born of the Vestal Virgin, Rhea Silvia. Even real historical figures were involved in such legends. They said the true father of Alexander the Great was Zeus. The mother of Emperor Augustus claimed he was conceived by the god Apollo. Numa identifies a clear pattern here that we could call the divine legitimation mechanism. In a world where emperors declared themselves gods, the story of a simple birth of a carpenter and his wife would have no weight. To compete in the market of ideas, the new Messiah needed an origin to match. The story of the birth from a virgin reveals itself less as a biological report and more as a powerful statement of political and theological marketing, telling the pagan world in a language it understood, "Our hero is not inferior to yours. His father is not Joseph of Nazareth, but God himself." The firewall has been breached. The miracle that was supposed to protect the story revealed itself as its weakest link. The supernatural and symbolic foundations of the canon have crumbled, but one last column remains, a pillar that seems to be made not of myth, but of solid historical granite. It is the statement by the evangelist Luke, a specific, bureaucratic, and in theory, verifiable declaration. The decree of Emperor Augustus and the population census conducted by Quirinius, governor of Syria. This sounds like a history book fact, not a miracle, not a prophecy, but the routine of imperial administration. It is this fact that gives the entire narrative an appearance of credibility. It is the nail on which the whole painting hangs. Today, we are going to place this nail under Numa's electronic microscope. We initiate the census vector. We will dive into the Roman annals, consular lists, and the works of independent historians of the time, and we will analyze this point in detail. We will prove with mathematical precision that the census described by Luke is not just an imprecision, but a chronological inconsistency that defies the entire official version from within, a historical anachronism that makes his narrative impossible. Let's reread the key lines, our source code for analysis. Gospel of Luke, chapter 2. In those days, Caesar Augustus published a decree ordering the census. This first census was done when Quirinius was governor of Syria. Here we have two fundamental data markers. The third marker, equally important, comes from the Gospel of Matthew. The birth of Jesus occurred during the life of King Herod the Great. We have three conditions that must be true at the same time. Herod is still alive, and Quirinius is governing Syria and conducting a census. Now let's turn off theology and turn on chronology. Numa has just processed all available data on the rule of these three historical figures. Let's start with King Herod. Historical science, based on numerous sources, including the writings of Flavius Josephus, dates the death of Herod the Great to the year 4 BCE. This is an established fact, not contested by any serious historian. Therefore, to believe Matthew, Jesus must have been born before the year 4 BCE. Keep that date in mind. Now let's move to Publius Sulpicius Quirinius. He was a real historical figure, a prominent Roman senator and military commander. His career is well documented, and here is where we find the first clash. According to all Roman records and crucially the testimony of the same Flavius Josephus, Quirinius was appointed governor of Syria and conducted his famous census in Judea in the year 6 CE. Look closely. It wasn't before Christ, it was after. Let's stop and absorb the magnitude of this catastrophe. Numa is overlaying the two timelines. Death of Herod, 4 BCE. Census of Quirinius, 6 CE. Between these two events there is an abyss of 10 years, a whole decade. Herod had already been dead for 10 years when Quirinius arrived in Syria to conduct his census. The two events not only do not coincide, they belong to different historical eras. The probability of their simultaneous occurrence is 0. This means that the chronology presented in the Gospels proves to be historically inconsistent. Jesus could not have been born in the days of Herod the Great and during the census of Quirinius. It's like saying someone was born during the American Civil War and also during the moon landing. They are mutually exclusive time markers. One of the evangelists, Matthew or Luke, is not telling the truth, and considering that Herod's reign was a much closer and more memorable event for the inhabitants of Judea than the appointment of a distant Roman official, the error was very likely Luke's. But why did he commit this error? Numa's analysis of Roman provincial legislation reveals another layer of inconsistencies. The census of Quirinius in 6 CE was not a routine event. It was an occurrence of enormous political importance. It was conducted because in that specific year, Rome finally removed Herod's son, Archelaus, from power and transformed Judea from a client kingdom into a full Roman province under direct administration. The objective of the census was to assess all property for the introduction of direct Roman taxation. The event was so traumatic and humiliating for the Jews that it provoked a major revolt led by Judas the Galilean, starting the Zealot movement. Now let's go back to Herod's time. Under his reign, Judea was not a province. Herod was a friend and ally king of the Roman people. He had internal autonomy, collected his own taxes, and paid a tribute to Rome. The Romans did not interfere in his fiscal affairs. Numa's political simulation is clear. An attempt by Rome to conduct a direct census in Herod's territory while he was alive would have been seen as a gross violation of his sovereignty. The paranoid Herod, who executed his own sons on suspicion of conspiracy, would never have tolerated such humiliation. Of course, theologians, seeing this hole in the narrative, tried to invent a solution. Perhaps Quirinius was governor of Syria twice, and Luke was referring to an earlier, undocumented census. It is a desperate attempt to invent events to save the text. Numa performed a complete search in all existing databases and found absolutely nothing. There is not a single piece of evidence, not even the vaguest, that Quirinius governed Syria before 6 CE. The hypothesis of a first census by Quirinius is classified by the system as a statement with 0 degree of verification. It only exists in the pages of the Gospel of Luke. The nail has been pulled out. The last historical anchor has collapsed. All stated motives, all official explanations revealed themselves as fiction. If everything they told us was a construction, what was the truth? If Mary and Joseph made that dangerous journey, not because of a census, not because of a prophecy, and not by divine order, then why? What real, urgent, and perhaps terrible motive forced them to leave their home at the most inopportune moment? We seem to have reached a dead end, but in Matthew's narrative there remains one element that until now we considered part of the myth. The mysterious cosmic phenomenon, the star. What was it really? We are in the midst of the ashes of the official version. Textual analysis revealed irreconcilable contradictions. Historical simulation showed that the canonical story is incompatible with the reality of Judea. Linguistics deconstructed the miracle, and chronology turned the census into an absurdity. All logical and supernatural reasons that should have led the Holy Family to Bethlehem proved to be fictitious. We are in an information vacuum, but one element remains, the most mysterious and the most poetic, and as we will show today, the most important, the celestial body that went down in history as the Star of Bethlehem. For 2 millennia, theologians called it a unique miracle, a divine marker created for the Magi. Scientists, in turn, tried to find a rational astronomical explanation, a comet, a supernova, a rare conjunction of planets. Today, we are going to end this debate. We initiate the star signature protocol. Numa analyzed not only the astronomical data, but the text of the Gospel of Matthew itself to understand how, according to the original source, this star behaved. And the conclusion is shocking for both sides. It was not a religious miracle, nor a known astronomical phenomenon. It was something else. Let's start by eliminating scientific hypotheses. Numa processed all celestial catalogues for the period in question. First candidate, a comet. It's a popular version, but Matthew's text says the Magi saw the star in the east, which implies they traveled west toward Jerusalem. Furthermore, and more importantly, a comet moves across the sky. It cannot stop over a specific location. Numa classifies the hypothesis as incompatible with the description. Second candidate, a supernova, the explosion of a star. This would explain a fixed point of light. But a supernova is a grand event, visible to everyone. It would have been recorded by astronomers from Rome to China. Numa searched all historical records of the time. Result: absolute silence. Furthermore, like any star, it would participate in the daily rotation of the sky, incapable of actively guiding a journey and pointing to a specific house. Third candidate, the scientist's favorite, a conjunction of planets. In 7 BCE, a rare triple conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn occurred. For Babylonian astrologers, it would be a powerful sign. Jupiter is the royal planet, Saturn the protector of the Jews, a conjunction indicating the birth of a new king. It sounds convincing, but the details in the text again spoil the theory. How could a conjunction of planets go before them? And how did it stop over the house? Planets follow a rigid and predictable path. They do not change trajectory to point to a building. Numa's analysis is conclusive. No known celestial phenomenon behaves like the star described by Matthew. It appeared and disappeared. It led travelers. It performed precise positioning over a terrestrial target. This is not the description of an astronomical body. It is the description of a guided object. Matthew's text, read as a report, describes a trajectory that corresponds to a luminous, intelligently controlled flying object. If the star was not an astronomical phenomenon, but a navigation system, then who were its operators? This leads us to the Magi. Our culture transformed them into the three wise men, but that is late folklore. The original text mentions no names, number, or royalty. It uses only one Greek word, magoi, magi. Today we initiate the Magi Marker Protocol. Who were they? The word magos was the designation for members of the priestly caste of Persia, the religious and intellectual heart of the Parthian Empire, Rome's main geopolitical rival. They were not wandering astrologers. They were the elite of the elite, advisors to kings, scientists, and holders of royal power. Numa simulated the geopolitical scenario. Rome and Parthia were in a cold war. Judea, ruled by Rome's puppet Herod, was the border zone. A delegation of such politically important figures crossing enemy territory would be an international incident. And they did not hide. They went straight to the capital, Jerusalem, to Herod's palace, and there they asked the most explosive question imaginable: where is the newborn king of the Jews? This is not a question, it is an act of political warfare. In front of the king appointed by Rome, they openly declare they are looking for an alternative king, a true king. Numa's simulation of the political consequences is clear. The only logical reaction from the paranoid Herod would be to arrest, torture, and execute these men as spies and instigators of a rebellion. But Matthew tells us Herod let them go, asking them to come back and tell him where the child was. This type of behavior is so unlikely, both psychologically and politically, that the entire scene seems like literary fiction. So what was their true mission? It wasn't worship, it was an intelligence operation. The Persian prophecies of the Magi spoke of a future savior, a Saoshyant, who would be born to lead the final battle of good against evil. They were not looking for the Jewish Messiah. They were looking for the incarnation of their own prophecy on foreign soil. It was an operation to find and perhaps control a figure they considered theirs, an extraction mission. The nativity scene dissolves, revealing the outlines of a special operation, guided by an unknown technology in the heart of enemy territory. But what did they find, and where exactly? We need to go to the epicenter. We need to analyze what Bethlehem actually was. The investigation has led us through a minefield of contradictions, anachronisms, and impossibilities. We followed a star that wasn't a star and identified Magi who were, in fact, agents of a foreign power. All the threads of our investigation now converge on a single point on the map, the small town in Judea, whose name became synonymous with miracle, Bethlehem. But what do we really know about this place? Our minds are filled with an immutable image: a wooden stable, a manger full of hay, an ox and a donkey warming a newborn with their breath. This image is engraved in our culture. Today we initiate the Bethlehem Epicenter Protocol. And the truth is, forget everything you know. This image is a cultural idealization. Numa performed a complete textual and archaeological analysis of the birth scene. The conclusion is startling. There is no stable, no farm animals, not even an inn in the sense we imagine in the original texts. Let's tear down this cozy set to show what it hides. Let's start with the source of all this iconography, the Gospel of Luke. He mentions that Mary placed the baby in a manger because there was no room for them in the inn. Two keywords. The original Greek word translated as inn is kataluma. Numa's linguistic module confirms that kataluma never meant a commercial inn. The word for that was pandokeion, which Luke himself uses elsewhere in his Gospel. Kataluma means a guest room, the upper room in a typical family house. The difference changes everything. Joseph and Mary were not kicked out by an evil innkeeper. They went to the house of relatives in Bethlehem, as was the custom. But because the house was full, the guest room was already occupied. They were not homeless. There was simply no space in the guest area. Where did they stay? The archaeology of first-century Palestinian houses gives us the answer. The typical house had an upper level for the family and guests and a lower level, often a cave or a room at ground level where the family's animals were kept at night. It wasn't a separate stable, but part of the main space of the house. The real scene was one of overcrowding, poverty and chaos, with a newborn lying in a manger, which was nothing more than a stone trough carved into the floor or wall. This was Luke's version. Now open Matthew's file, where he says, "The Magi, on coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary in a house." Numa warns of a critical divergence. Luke describes a birth in makeshift and emergency conditions. Matthew describes a visit to a normal house, perhaps even 2 years later. The two scenes are incompatible. The traditional nativity scene with shepherds and magi together is what the system defines as a composite fiction. But if we discard the scenes, what remains is the city, Bethlehem. Why? Yes, it was the city of David. But there was another, darker meaning. Numa's analysis reveals that ancient Jewish texts indicate that the fields around Bethlehem were the location where the sacrificial lambs for the temple in Jerusalem were raised and selected. Bethlehem was the place where the lambs destined to atone for the sins of Israel were born. It is to this place, saturated with symbolism of royalty and sacrifice, that the Persian Magi are guided. And this leads us to the final act of the drama. Herod's order, the massacre of all the boys in Bethlehem, the act of absolute evil that should have left a bloody scar on the memory of a people. We initiate the silence protocol. Numa searched all historical sources of the time not linked to the Bible. We focused on the historian Flavius Josephus, who hated Herod and meticulously listed all his crimes, from the murder of his wife to the execution of his own sons. Numa looked for a single mention of the massacre of children. The result, absolute and deafening silence. The probability that such a monstrous event occurred, but the greatest chronicler of Herod's crimes forgot to mention it, is 0. The system concludes with 99.9% certainty. No historical source of the time, outside the Gospel, mentions the massacre of the innocents. It was a literary invention of Matthew with a clear purpose, to create a direct parallel between Jesus and Moses, whose origin story involves a pharaoh massacring Hebrew babies. It is a theological rewriting. And if the massacre didn't happen, the flight to Egypt, the persecution, and the return are also part of the fiction. What are we left with? A man from Nazareth, a family story about a difficult birth in a cave near Bethlehem, perhaps during a pilgrimage. Decades later, his followers face a narrative challenge. Their Messiah has the wrong biography. And so begins the great process of myth-building. To prove his royal lineage, 2 conflicting genealogies are invented. To place him in Bethlehem, Luke invents an anachronistic census, and Matthew, an original residence that requires a fictitious escape. To prove his divinity, the virginal birth trope is inserted. To show his universal appeal, Luke adds Jewish shepherds and Matthew, pagan magi. Human history, simple and raw, was buried under layers of a grand myth. But why? What was the final objective? We then realize that the story of Christmas reveals itself less as a report of events and more as a perfectly designed ideological capsule, a cultural code with a purpose to transform civilization. Its modules are genius, universality. What we discover in the end has 2 sides. The story of Christmas is, in its details, a construction, but this construction became the most powerful social and spiritual engineering tool in human history. It gave voice to the voiceless and created a new moral universe in which we still live. Numa has concluded its analysis. The code has been revealed. What to do with it now is your decision. But now you know. If you liked this analysis, your subscription to the channel helps us continue investigating themes like this. We would love to read your reflection on the subject in the comments and know which city you are watching us from.